And as soon as I had that realization that this is God, that's when he said I could come into the light. So I walked into the light. I mean, I didn't waste any time. I walked right in. And as soon as I did, it was as if a waterfall or a rushing, raging river was pouring into my being. And it was full of love. It was almost like a river of love just crashing into my body, into my being. And it was wonderful. It was, when you think about any suffering that you go through, and I had just went through this enormous amount of suffering, all of that was being replaced with love, with peace and joy. It was as if he was mending those broken places that we all have in our lives. Well, mine were being mended at this point. I had said that I was a soldier and I had done a lot of extreme things in my life. With that comes sometimes some painful memories, and all that stuff was erased. I looked at it as if those were things that helped me to get to this point and experience this love to a degree that I wouldn't have been able to had I not had those experiences. So the suffering that I went through, I had a total transformation in how I viewed it. And as I'm walking through this light, I have to describe the way this love felt, like with using a straw. We all have drank from a straw. You got the fluid in the cup and you drink it through the straw. And as you drink it in, it goes into your mouth, of course. But in the straw itself, it's always new. It's always fresh because it's never the same liquid. It's always circulating and coming into your mouth and becoming fresh and new from the bottom. That's what this love was like. It was constantly new and fresh. It wasn't just a love that came into me and just sat there. It was going through me and back out into heaven here. But it was fresh and new in that straw. And I had this understanding that this is how heaven was meant to be, that you're going to feel God's love, his presence, fresh and new for all of eternity. It will never be the same. It will always be new, never get boring and used to it because it's always fresh. And that was such a wonderful, peaceful feeling to have because it's such a contrast to that suffering, to feel that love. And that's when I said I wanted to see Jesus. And as soon as I said that, the light opened up and there was this great room, kind of like a lobby into a hotel. It's like this entry point. But it was huge. It wasn't like that dark void. It was full of light and full of beings, and it was encompassed in light. And it was enormous. It could have swallowed several of those dark voids. But in this room were countless beings. I could say millions, but I think, we look at a beach, you see a bunch of sand on the beach. That's what this was like, just full of beings though. And I'm looking at them and they all had the torso of a human being, but with bright, shining, sparkling, radiant lights. Different degrees of lights and different beings. But, when you look under a microscope and you see a cell and you see it moving around, all the different material in it, and, it's all moving. That's what it was kind of like, but with light instead of, the stuff we see in the cell. But they had that torso of a human being, and in the center of all of these beings, there was one that was brighter than all of the rest, just eclipsed in brightness. And this one had the same level of magnificence as that light that was surrounding this entire room. And I knew that this room wasn't the end of it. That's why I call it kind of the lobby, is that it wasn't the fullness of heaven or wherever I was at, right? I knew that this wasn't the end stop, that this was just a glimpse of what was to come. And as I'm seeing Jesus, I didn't need him to introduce himself. Your intelligence is so maximized at this point. I was able to have all the thoughts of my entire life, the experiences, the ideas I've had, any thought that I actually had in life. feelings, all of it at once. I was able to understand it all as if it's right there, and I just had to pick and choose which one I wanted to focus on. But it wasn't confusing. It was as if I was able to have it sitting there and understand every aspect of it without it overwhelming my intellect. And so when I saw Jesus, it wasn't as if he needed to identify himself. It was clear who he was. And I said, I wanted to see his face because he was so bright. The light was just so bright. And as his face came together, so did all the faces and appearances of all the other beings. The only problem is with his face, I wasn't able to lay down the memory. So people often ask me, what does he look like? Does he look like this painting or does he look like that one? And that doesn't really work for me because they all kind of look like how we imagine Jesus to be. But as far as my memory of what he actually looked like, I have that bright light. Like his face stayed as bright as you could imagine. It was like that light that was surrounding this place. And that's all I can remember, even as I was there. And knowing I'm seeing his face with his features and that he was smiling at me, I could see the love in his eyes and the way he was looking at me. I could identify all of those things, but my memory wasn't able to remember what it looked like. So I lost it immediately. Kind of like, you ever seen one of those little books with the animations in it and you flip the pages and it goes really fast and it's always moving because, each one kind of advances the stage of the animation. That's what it was like. I was losing the impression of his face every second that my memory couldn't remember it, and I was seeing a new part of his expression. And yet, like I said, he was smiling at me. And so we had to go through my life. We started talking, think that when I say talking to, I want to make sure that it's clear that it was not auditory. It was as if I understood his thoughts and he understood mine. It was just a beautiful exchange as this connection between him and I was growing. And yet we were going over my life. All those things that I had for 7 hours, that time to confess, those were all reviewed. But I truly felt sorry for those things. So it wasn't as if he was holding a grudge against me or some anger, because his face never changed from that smile and that love and kindness in his eyes. While he didn't like the things that I had done, I mean, we all can see that those things that we do that we know are wrong, we shouldn't be doing them. But it was more of him showing me why that was wrong and how it hurt other people, how it hurt him. That was real convicting to me, to be able to see the fullness of the consequences of the things that I had done. But what really got me was things that I didn't do, things that I should have done, but I didn't do, because sometimes in life we don't want to be singled out, or we don't want to, risk our neck for somebody else. And, we know it's wrong to not do it because there's an injustice being done, but we can justify why it's okay in this situation for us to sit back. And sometimes we justify other things, like why I can do this because this person did this to me. And yet we miss the fact that we're doing this horrible thing as well in retaliation, or just as a consequence of what they have done. And instead of doing something more pure and more kind and more loving, we take this low road to get an action that we want, that benefits us, to try to make up for this injustice that we have perceived. All of that was really hard to see, because there's rippling effects to the actions that we do. And this was really difficult for me to go through. And yet here he was, loving me, smiling at me. And I could see this growth in how I was understanding my connection with other people through him, through that love that he has for all of us, as opposed to me really loving myself. And, during this time, I had this memory that I had completely spaced out my whole life, but it was probably, I might have been 5 or 6 years old. And my great grandmother had died. And it was, a state away. So we had to drive quite far. It was like 4 or 5 hour drive to get back. And, as a little kid, you're pretty tired. But when you get back, you just want to go right to bed. And I didn't this time because during this funeral, I saw my aunts and my uncles, everybody crying because my great-grandmother was so beloved. She was just a wonderful person. And I didn't want my family to suffer like that at my death. So I prayed, and it must have been at least an hour, maybe longer, that as a little kid, I was on my knees praying and asking God to, let me have a long life. And I got one of those feelings where, you kind of feel just peaceful, that the prayer was answered. And I went to bed and didn't ever think about it for the rest of my life. And, I grew up not terribly religious either. So this was, easy for me to forget about. But here I remembered it, and I asked him, I said, well, what about that prayer? I really thought you answered it. And he said that he had, and that he did give me the granting of my request for a long life. And yet I was, 41 or 42 at this time. I didn't really consider that to be a long life. And what he showed me was that it still stood, that his answer to that was still available for me to collect, to take good on. But it wasn't for my aunts and my uncles and all my other family members. I mean, it was to a degree, but I had my own family now. I had my wife and my kids, and that's what he was at that time. When I was 5 or 6, he was answering it so that my young family, my kids were tiny, and they were little kids at this time, that they wouldn't have to suffer at my death. It was quite amazing to see the providence that he has, the planning that goes into his love for us in our lives, to be able to have that. I mean, it's like a master chess player playing with a 1-year-old. He's 40 moves ahead of us. It was incredible to see just how caring he was in his plan for me, that he thought about that moment that I would die and that my kids would suffer and my wife would be suffering without me. And then he asked me, well, why would you want to go back? Now, this was a tough question to think about, because there's a lot of reasons that as a human being living a life, you just have it ended, that you'd want to go back. Well, I got to, do a whole bunch of things, tie up some loose ends. And, but I thought, well, my family needs me. But that was clearly not the right reason, because he already had planned out for my family, and he loved them more than I do. He loves you more than anybody in your life loves you. So he feels that love for all of us to such a degree that there's nothing any of us can really do that compares to the amount of love that he has for us. And I could feel that. I knew that was the truth. So I'm trying to rack my brain for why I should go back. And it came to me that I wanted to do more for him because of that love that I was feeling, that I wanted to share it with other people. I didn't want to go back to live the same kind of life that I had, really more from a self-interest point of view. I wanted to go back and live a life for him, to really share how much he loves us. Because, I was more science-based before all this. I'm a psychotherapist by trade, and I really believed a lot in the scientific method. And I got caught up in the idea that if you can't prove it with our menial little human instruments that can't possibly measure anything into the afterlife, I really wrote off a lot of things that were very spiritual. And here I am experiencing it to really have this transformation on me, that I really wanted to come back and share that with others, so that people don't go through the same mistakes that I made in my life. And, like I had said earlier, all this, I tell it in a linear fashion because I don't know how to tell it otherwise. But while he was teaching me through the things that I had done, and he was giving me that experience of understanding of what he went through and others went through, the whole ripple effect, he taught me 3 things that I needed to do. And so the first one was that I needed to pray more. And praying more is having that constant conversation with God, not letting our lives go back to, focusing on ourselves and the things that we want in our lives, and to the exclusion of everything else around us, which is very easy as a human being to do. But it was to live my life as a constant prayer for everything that I do to be for a greater good, not to be something that only benefits me. It doesn't mean I can't still live a life that does benefit me. There certainly isn't anything wrong with that, but not to make it be the primary purpose. There are times that I have to suffer something that's maybe inconvenient. Traffic is a good example. I don't particularly like traffic, but it sure isn't very kind of me to go smashing around everybody and try to get ahead of everyone. But we often have that instinct in us to try to be first, to try to have things for ourselves and stake our claim. And I'm finding that living a life of prayer means sometimes evaluating, is this good for me only, or is letting this other person have an advantage better for everybody? Because that person might not have that kind of experience in their life without somebody giving them assistance. Things like that, just living a life that allows us to be more connected than dispersed. And, with that comes the second one, which is to suffer joyfully. And that's also a part of the prayer, because I found that he was showing me how I can connect my suffering to his, and that's where true love comes from. When you think about how Jesus died, he gave his whole life up for us. And, that's hard for people to wrap their heads around, because as human beings, we're not really inclined to do something like that. And yet, when we go through suffering, and we all will, that's kind of like the price tag of admission to life itself, is we all are growing older every day, and we will eventually die. And how we die usually isn't the most pleasant means that somebody is going to be living, because you're dying. But even with that, there's poverty, there's job losses, there's health issues, there's all kinds of things that we can put into that list of things that people consider to be suffering. And when we go through it alone, we really realize what we're losing, but we don't have that community to build us up. But when we offer it up to God, we can apply it to his, and we can offer that for others. We don't have to suffer just in a terrible situation on our own. And that adds value to our suffering, as opposed to just suffering for the sake of suffering, which really is not a good way to try to experience that. And so the third thing that he told me was to share his love. And clearly that was the realization that I had of why I was able to come back and why I needed to come back, was to share his love, to give that back to other people, to live my life in a way that reflects the love that I was experiencing there. And so as I had those realizations, and this experience was coming to an end, and I had made that decision to go back, that's when he said, okay, now it's time for you to go back. And that's the last I saw of Jesus. The light returned, and I had to go back the exact same way that I had come in, except now it felt like I was walking through concrete that was hardening, something like really thick mud at the bottom of a murky lake, and you're sinking down into it. It's just so hard to move, almost painful to try to move, because you got to use every bit of your strength to get through this. And it was intensifying every step I was taking away from where I had experienced Jesus. And yet, as I get back to that dark tunnel that led to that dark void, I realized that it wasn't that dark void at the end of this tunnel any longer. That it was my hospital room, my body, my life. And I could see everything that was happening. I could see what the doctors and nurses were doing. They had this big machine on me. It's called a Lucas machine. It does chest compressions. And I'm going back to this, and I'm having this realization that when I came in, it was a dark void. And that's really what I brought to heaven. I didn't bring anything of value. I brought me. That's it. That's the only thing I was able to go with. And it wasn't anything that I had created. It was created by by God, because I don't have that ability to do it. But I brought nothing with me. And now I'm going back to that same life. And I knew that I didn't want to return with the same emptiness. I wanted to bring something the next time, something of joy, something of love, something of peace, to reflect that love and peace and joy that I was feeling here. And so I'm walking back to this body of mine. And as soon as I got back to my body, I snapped into place. I didn't have to have anybody explain how to do it. It just was intuitive. But what was really interesting in my medical records, doctors put down that, I spontaneously revived. As I was getting closer to it, they took that machine off. So they were stopping the chest compressions. Now, I don't know that they were going to call it, or if they were going to do some other form of life-saving procedures to try to keep me going. But it did appear that they were giving up, particularly by the doctor's response, because they have you strapped down and they have tubes in your mouth, and they're doing all kinds of different things to you. So you got like ice packs, all kinds of stuff on your head. I don't know of all the things, but I know that I was weighted down. And I tried to lift my head up to ask the doctor if I had just died. Now, I knew I had just died, but I wanted to have medical proof that they saw what I know happened. I wanted to have that. And so I asked the doctor if I died. And he had to get a little bit closer because it's hard to understand, when you got a tube in your mouth. But he asked me again, and I said it again, did I just die? And he says, yeah, you just died. So he tries to comfort me to get me to lay back down. And I was so enamored with the look on his face was priceless, because you could tell that he was totally shocked that this guy, who was in such a terrible state prior to this. I mean, they were shocking me left and right when I was dying, and it was serious business. And here I am, peaceful and calm after having experienced. And when you get those chest compressions, it's a strong, heavy machine. It broke several of my ribs. I mean, there was additional pain to what I had already been experiencing. Now has flooded back to me, and to a point where when I snapped back into my body, I could feel like that portal or that tunnel closed off. So that connection with God seemed to close off, but it wasn't that it was closed. I knew intuitively that it was still fully connected, but it was these distractions that we all experience in life. All the noise, all the chaos that came rushing back, that pain came flooding back, the worry about, am I going to die again? Am I going to, all these different things were trying to oppress me. I couldn't stop my brain from thinking about all those things. I didn't have the same kind of intellectual control as I did in heaven. So, you got all those things that we all know how that feels. You got a lot of things in your mind and a lot of things happening to our bodies. But I knew that connection was still open. I could still feel his love. But it was just on my end that I had to deal with these distractions that life throws at us. And so, having known that I was going to come back to more pain, I was a little bit prepared for it. So, but it is quite a startling response to go from this peace and love and joy to this immense pain again. And so they had to do a lot of procedures, but I'm gonna kind of gloss over that. So for the next 2 years at this point, I have to go through all this suffering and through all this pain up until I get a heart transplant. So that's how bad my heart was. And my heart, when they took it out, they said that there's no way my heart should have been working. They pointed out 4 or 5 different places in my heart that were so severely damaged from that scar tissue that it couldn't have possibly been operating as a normal human heart. And we all know that a heart is a supple muscle. It's got to be able to beat. Well, scar tissue is not supple. It's hard. It's rough. And what it does is it prevents proper electrical conduction and makes it so your heart can't beat properly. That's why I was having those high arrhythmias. But my heart was so severely damaged that when they took it out, they said that they wanted to keep it and go around teaching other doctors about my condition by using my heart as an example because of how bad that it really was, which was such a wonderful experience because, when you have doctors tell you, hey, we don't know how to explain what has happened, to me, that's just such a contrast to to how I used to live my life, where I was always looking for medical reasons for things, evidence, based practices of any kind that would prove that something is true or not. And there really is no way to explain the miraculous, to explain something so spiritual that had a physical consequence that we could actually see. This guy's living, yet he had died, and his heart wasn't working, and it was just an amazing end of all this experience. And so that's the story. It's if you have some questions to follow up with, I'd be happy to answer them.
It's an amazing story, Brian. But let me ask you about Jesus, because you had this deep connection with Jesus on the other side. Can you explain me, please, what's your understanding of Jesus? How, because you've been over there face to face with Jesus. Who is Jesus in your opinion? And what does it mean that he is a son of God? Aren't we all children of God, or he is a special son of God?
Well, I'll start with that part first, because the second part is quite easy to explain. But he definitely is special. The way that I was attracted to him, the way that he commanded his presence, the way that he was able to forgive me of the things that I had done, that doesn't come without some special power. I could forgive you for something you've done to me, but it doesn't forgive that part of you that experiences that you've done wrong, or you've done something harmful to somebody else. That guilt that we can have, that's something that lingers in us. And there was power to this. There was power to his forgiveness, and that comes from the fact of who he is. What I experienced of him was love. That's what I would describe him as love. And love can overcome so many things. Imagine them, somebody that you're in love with. You have this great relationship with her, and she does something that's offensive or harms you in some way, and then she's really sorry about it. You're going to forgive her. You may have already forgiven her to a point because you love so deeply. That's what it was like with him, is that there was just so much overwhelming love and mercy. And I got the impression that his mercy and his justice were equal. There was going to be some of both. But I was throwing myself on his mercy. I wasn't resisting that in any way. And so that's what I experienced. I experienced this love and mercy to such a degree that it was actually able to transform me, even as I come back now. And, I live the rest of my life with that memory, and nothing can touch me. Nothing harmful does anything to me. The doctors have said, well, you're going to have a liver transplant. You're going to have a kidney transplant. None of that stuff worried me. Of course, all of that is now healed up pretty miraculously in itself, but that's another story. But, when you have those kinds of things on you that you're diagnosed with, that the doctors still think you're going to die, and you're not worried about it. Yet, as I told you beforehand, I was definitely worried about dying. So everything had changed, and it was due to that love.
Okay, second question about Jesus. How Jesus gave his life for us? This is first. Second, didn't Jesus have already an eternal life? I mean, he already has an eternal life. How he can give his life for us if he has an eternal life? Did I make myself clear or not?
Yeah, no, you make yourself clear. And I think that's kind of like how we are too. We have a soul in our being. There's all of us know that we have thoughts. I guess if we compare our thoughts to, maybe that's who we are. We kind of really identify ourselves to our thoughts. Although we have random thoughts that don't relate to who we are. We just sometimes randomly think things like, maybe we're in traffic like I was using earlier, and we say, I want to run that guy over. We don't really want to run him over. We just are frustrated at the situation we find ourselves in. But take away part of our body, Soldiers, sometimes they lose part of their body, they lose limbs. That doesn't make them less of who they are. They physically may have less, but who they are spiritually, who they are inside their soul and their very being is still the same. Now, when it comes to God, as I was talking about that light, imagine that huge light that encompassed that room. And the same light was there present in Jesus. That was the exact same light, and yet here's the one still surrounding the room and has its own kind of being, and yet it's still the same. It's still the same being in the essence of its nature as God, which is Jesus. Although Jesus is different because he also has that physical body, which I didn't see in the light. And that physical body came in a different period of time than obviously what I was experiencing there. And while I was experiencing time in a very different way, we understand that when we leave this life, we're going to be exiting time as we know it. And that's true. But for him to come into time, there had to be a special point because he wasn't in at the very beginning, although he created it from the very beginning. There's no separation between him and that light that was God. And yet that physical point where he entered into life, that's the point that he became that physical being connected to that body that he got from life, which is quite miraculous, quite amazing. It's something that's beyond me theologically to be able to fully explain. I think that comes through faith. For me, it's a lot easier because I saw it. So I can describe what I saw, but I look at that, and if you're, you had asked about how do you explain it to somebody who doesn't believe, and I think that's something that when people who listen to my story and they're like, Brian, I really struggle with this because I wasn't raised Christian. Well, even being raised Christian, there's plenty of Christians who aren't really Christian. They don't live a Christian life. They might talk the talking points, but they don't really believe it. And they're further away than maybe somebody who just is confused and doesn't understand. But when people ask me and they're genuine about it and they say, Brian, I just don't understand this whole thing. But I do see how you're living your life, and there's something that makes me curious about it. I want to understand it a little more. It's pretty simple. We all have to have a personal relationship with God, and that can only come through talking to him. Now, somebody who doesn't believe, it's going to be hard for them to have that in-depth conversation as I can now. However, I'm not going to sit there and question God, but a person who doesn't believe, there's nothing wrong with them saying, God, I just don't understand. I don't get you. Can you give me some insight? Can you show me something that, will help me through my disbelief? Because there's nothing wrong with having disbelief. It is hard as a human being to have physical eyes and not see some evidence of it. And I think that's really the beginning of that relationship. That's something that I was able to be given because I actually physically saw. I don't know that everybody wants to go through the same experience I had to go through to be able to have that realization. But I think God works in a lot of different ways, and he can tailor it to whatever it is, as long as we sincerely want to know. And if people don't want to know, well, they're going to find out regardless. I just hope that if they're staring at that dark void, they look for that light and they choose to go that direction as opposed to into that darkness or staying there and just feeling that joy and love until the end. And it might be too late.
Okay, so people who don't believe in Jesus, non-Christians, are they still saved, or they go to some different place, different location?
Well, I can't fully answer for that. I could answer for it from my own personal beliefs, but that's not really what we're wanting here. From my experience, I know that he loves every single person, regardless of what they believe. I mean, even a person who hates him, which is kind of baffling to me. It's hard for me to even like people who hate me, but he's so much better. He loves every single person, regardless. I felt that mercy. I know that once I was looking at that dark void, and I wanted to experience where that love was from. I knew it couldn't have been coming from there. I wanted to have it from God. I knew it was God. I turned towards him. But I find it very hard to believe that anybody, even somebody who doesn't believe in God, would reject that love, because that love was so overwhelming. I can't even begin to tell you how wonderful it was to feel that. There's nothing that I've ever felt that felt so safe and so secure and so true as his love, which I think would have just overwhelmed the staunchest of atheists. But he also doesn't force us to do that. You know, he gave me even free choice to turn. He gave me free choice to walk there. I don't think he's going to force himself on anyone, but it is going to be offered.
Okay, so the light you saw, there's a big, beautiful light. Was that light God, or was that light Jesus? Or Jesus appeared later?
Yep, Jesus appeared later, and they both were so connected that I couldn't have separated the two. However, when I first got to that light, it was clear that that was God. It was different. You know, like I said, I didn't hear an auditory, but I could understand what he was saying, what he was thinking, and that was clearly different than the impression I got with Jesus. You know, I didn't have to have Jesus identify himself as here I am, but I knew it was Jesus, and I knew that this was God. So there was a definite contrast, but yet they were so similar as to be the same.
Okay, so let's try to understand again a little bit. So let's call Jesus a representative of people on earth. Let's say he represents human beings on this planet. Can I say so or not?
I don't see why not. I think that's a pretty fair assessment.
Yeah. All right. So basically, he incarnated on earth. He became one of us, so we can believe, and he could feel the same as we feel, you know.
Yeah,
Um, but why then he was crying to God when he was crucified? He was like, God, take this from me. You know, he was suffering. Although he knew he is the Son of God and he is God actually, he was still suffering.
yeah. I think that can be explained by, you know, when I was staring at him and he was staring back at me and we were going over my life, that's very similar to when he was crying in the garden, because when he was there, he knew that I was going to do those things. Of course, he knew what you were going to do too, and I don't know what you were going to do, but he did. And you know, he's looking at all the things that he's going to endure out of pure love. You know, it's as if we, you know, if you had a child that was going to suffer and you could take their place, you would do it. And you might be brought to tears simply because of how much love you have. You know, I'm not a big crier. The only times I've ever cried are either at injustice, which certainly was something he was facing. It was an injustice to have somebody innocent have to die for the rest of others. And that's why the representative idea is so good, because he is our representative of taking on all of our sins. But the other times that I will cry is when I'm happy in love. You know, the birth of a child, you know, something that's so pure and so loving that you just have this uncontrollable emotion. I don't cry about, oh, I, you know, stubbed my toe, or I don't cry about if I lose a job. I don't cry about anything else. But those two things, you know, injustice and love. And I think that's such a mixture too, when he was in that garden thinking about all the things that he would endure, and thought about how much he loved us and that it was worth it to still go through it for us. I mean, that's the most profound love anyone can ever imagine. Even a person who doesn't believe, you know, that this is true. Of course, it's hard to imagine how we could not. There's so much evidence just historically that this event occurred. However, just to think about, if all these Christians are right and he loved us to where somebody who made us is going to come and sacrifice their life to try to bring us all to back to that connection with him, that's amazing. I mean, think about how amazing that really is, that we're loved like that. Because if I was God, I have a tendency to say, well, this one's really angering me today. I'm going to squish that one, and that one, I'm going to put that one over here. Yeah, I'm not
Well,
very kind that way.
but that's what's happening in the Old Testament. God is punishing everybody over there. You remember the Old Testament?
Yeah, I do. But when you look at the Old Testament, even I've got different eyes where I see things now in a very different way. I used to feel the same way. I was like, man, God was really harsh back in the Old Testament. But what I've looked at is how many times Israel turned their back on God. And he was so kind. Like remember when I said that I could have stayed looking at that dark void, but I chose to go to the light. That was free choice. He wasn't making me do it. But had I wanted to stay there and look at that dark void, it would have been just like with Israel. He would have let me go my own way. Israel, they were slaves to Egypt, and then they kept trying to make deals to go back to Egypt instead of following God. And God's like, well, you're not going to like the results. The results are going to be tough because he knows what's going to happen. But he let them go their own way. He let them fall to the Babylonians. He let them fall to these major powers that we can see even in our own histories, that these powers were like voracious wolves. They were just devouring everything. Quite impressive from a military point. I love that kind of history. But when we turn our back on God, that's what he'll say. You're free to do what you want, and he doesn't force us because he loves us. But the consequences are quite severe. And I think we see that even in our own lives. We look at countries all over the world, and people will fight over all kinds of reasons. And yet we see that those often will lead to more destruction because we just can't stop when we get started. We really have a tough time resolving that into a peaceful decision after we've initiated combat.
Yeah, isn't this interesting that Jesus was born in Israel and basically the human nationality was Jewish, and the Jews don't believe in Jesus, and they
Yes, sad.
actually persecute. They persecute
Yes.
Christians actually, and also why do they consider themselves chosen people?
Yeah, I think as far as the Old Testament goes, there was a level of truth to that chosenness. However, they missed the point. The point isn't about a nationality. God doesn't care so much about the nationality. He chose to work his miracles through them, to bring his revelation through them. But it was actually to be children of Abraham, which they think that they are, but it's a spiritual child, that love for God. When you look at the heroes of the Old Testament, they always lived this very virtuous life for God. And yet, the very people who often killed them were the Israelites, the very own people. Always killed the good, holy prophets every single time. It's a constant conundrum that they just were constantly killing the good and the holy. And when you get to the Christians, boy, you're right. They really hated Christians. I mean, it's the persecution it still goes on today. I mean, if you say things like Christ is King or Jesus is Lord, anything like that, you will see this vitriol hate that will come from certain members of that particular group. Not even so much the religion is, they're all going to be converted and they're going to see the Messiah when he comes back. For them, it's going to be a shock because it is going to be Jesus. But everything else, they know that these things are true because they had the prophecies. They knew the Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem. They knew all these different things. But they were tricked by their leaders to not believe in Jesus, and they did persecute. However, many, many Jews were the first Christians. And Jews convert all the time to become Christians because they get to a point where they realize, wow, Jesus fulfills all of the prophecies except for the ones that regard coming back, because he's going to come back. He just hasn't done it yet. So that's the beautiful thing about the Bible, is it has relayed everything that will happen in time.
Yeah, you said that they're gonna see Jesus, but another version here is that everybody sees on the other side what they believe they're going to see. Let's say a Buddhist going to see Buddha, a Hindu going to see Krishna, for example, a Christian are going to see Christ, and Jewish people may see Moses. Who knows? Do you think they're going to see Jesus still or not?
Oh, absolutely. Moses never was able to save him. He died in the desert right along with the Israelites. So the older generation wasn't able to go in to the promised land. And there's no saving power in that. The power never came from Moses. It came from God. And, for a Buddhist or any of those other things, we can look at religions and see that there is no end game. I love how peaceful Buddhists can often be. But when we're focusing on emptiness, we're meditating on emptiness, that leaves us with a lot of nothing. And I want love and peace and joy, that fullness of that experience that we know we're made for. I mean, we all crave love. We all crave peace. We all crave joy, the things that are so inherent to human beings.
Yeah, but Brian, let me ask you this. You were a Christian before this NDE. You believed in Christ. You went to church or not?
Yeah, I started not going to as I hate to admit it, as a Catholic, I'm supposed to go to mass every Sunday. I got really caught up with work. I got ambitious with work, and I was not always a very good Catholic the years leading up to this. I lived a lot of my life trying not to believe in God. As a young man, it definitely seemed to me to get in the way of some of the things I wanted to do, which were not always kind. They were very selfish things, those kinds of things, morally aren't right, but there's a way we as human beings can rationalize, well, it's good for me. I'm not really hurting anybody physically. Who cares about their emotions? We can rationalize a lot of things. And so I lived a life that wasn't a Christian life, and
Well, the reason I ask you, I'm going to interrupt you. I'm sorry, I don't interrupt usually my guests, but I'm going to interrupt you here. The reason I ask is because you were a Christian, okay, you were not going to the Mass, you're not going to the church all the time, but you're still a Catholic. That was your background. This is why you encountered Jesus. Coming back to my previous questions, that let's say a Buddhist dies and he's going to see Buddha. He never heard, let's say somebody lives in a cave somewhere. He never heard of Jesus. Never ever heard of Jesus. And he dies, what? He goes to hell?
well, like I said before, Jesus has mercy. I think people are going to see that dark void. You know, I can always say from my experience what I saw, but I do think that there is a level of truth that can't be wiped out. It has to be very similar in all human experience. I don't think that a Buddhist is going to see Buddha because Buddha was a man, not God. I think that we can look and see things that people are craving in their religions, and there's goodness to that craving, as long as it leads to holiness, leads to truth. But when it stops without going to the fullness of truth, that reveals that it doesn't have the entirety of what we need as human beings for truth. And truth in those other religions doesn't, from my experience, translate into heaven. There was only Jesus. There wasn't Buddha. There wasn't Muhammad. There wasn't anything else that was there to represent anything. And I've studied those religions. It wasn't as if I was ignorant of them. In fact, I tried when I was not having, strong faith. I was trying to find other religions that would appeal to me in a more profound way. So I guess the same argument could be that somebody who's open-minded to all these kinds of faiths should have been able to see all of them,
Yeah.
or have. But I didn't have any kind of control over who was there. It was who really was there. There was a
Yeah.
reality to this that is beyond a human desire.
Okay. So let's see a Buddhist, coming back again to the same question. Buddhist dies, a Buddhist, and he sees this light. And there appears Jesus in front of him. He never heard of Jesus. And Jesus tells him, I am Jesus. And the Buddha is like, what? I don't know who Jesus is. I'm just
Yeah.
seeing the light here. And the light is God. And this is what I believe in. I don't know who you are, but I love you. I feel your love. Something like that.
Hmm. Well, you know what's interesting about that is that like remember how I said that your intelligence is so much that you have every thought, every idea, every experience, emotion, whatever. All those things are there. It's not just limited to you. It's limited to everything. There was nothing that was hidden from my intelligence or from my view or any of my other abilities. And for that Buddhist, he's going to understand this is Jesus. I didn't have to have Jesus identify that it was him. The Buddhist is going to have the same experience as long as they keep going down that path. I assume that maybe they're even living a holier life than me, and he's going to have more mercy on them because they didn't have that kind of knowledge that I had. But that's where mercy is so profound, is that he's not going to hold it against somebody who lived in a country where they never were able to learn about him. But at that moment of death, they're going to be infused with that knowledge. And they are going to have that experience that you described. They're going to feel that love. They're going to feel how much he cares for them. And I just can't see how anybody could reject that, particularly somebody who's living a good life and trying to be a good person is going to reject goodness itself, love itself, truth itself. I just don't see how they would reject it. I think that person probably is going to have an easier time than I did. I think that somebody who truly is living a holier life is going to see this is why I've been living the way I have. I just didn't know it was Jesus.
Okay, so let's say a murderer or a big criminal, a war criminal, let's say Hitler, appears in front of this light. Is he going to be forgiven as well? Is he going to be loved by God the same as a righteous person? Or he has to go through some kind of hell?
Well, I think Hitler's an interesting example to use because he's so extreme in his views. I think that it's hard to know from my experience however, that love and that mercy that I was describing, it is equal to his justice. There has to, I really understood that if I was to do something, when I was going through my life, I understood that if I took something from somebody, I could feel sorry about it, but I didn't give it back. An injustice was done that never was repaid, and there's consequences that happen in life because of that. That person went without that thing, then the next thing happened. That ripple effect continued on, causing more and more damage just from my one action. And I think the fact that I had that 7 hours to really go through before I died, to really lay out there and go through all the things I did, but I was truly sorry. Now I think somebody who's very extreme, somebody who's killing a lot of people, somebody who's just got hate in their heart, I find very hard that they're going to not continue with that hate as they go onto the other side. In fact, they may become more established in their hate and really say, well, you know what? You weren't there for me, God. I didn't need you, or I didn't want you. And they're going to be living in that eternity of hate for the rest of their existence. And I don't think that you can mesh that with God because he's the complete opposite. He's all love.
Okay, so that's called hell. They're gonna choose
Yeah,
the
I think they'll choose
eternal,
hell.
yeah, suffering. I remember I was in Los Angeles, and there is a cemetery. It's a big cemetery. I think it's called Forest Lawn in Glendale, California. And I remember I was there visiting, and I saw a wall full of the same painting, the Last Supper. You remember the Last Supper, right?
Yep, I do.
And that's like 100 pictures of Last Supper from different parts of the world. The way everybody sees Jesus. If there was a Last Supper from Africa, Jesus was black and all the disciples were black. If that Last Supper from Asia. Jesus was Asian, and all disciples are Asian,
Sure.
and so on. It's all different nationalities see Jesus the way they like to see. Just to coming back to your comment, when you saw Jesus on the other side, did you see Jesus with your heart, or you actually saw a figure with your eyes?
That's a really good question. I didn't see my body, so I don't know that I actually had eyes. I do know my human eyes were still in that hospital room. Um, it really was more of an infused knowledge. It was something that was impressed upon me versus anything that I could gather and make sense of. I didn't have that ability. It was infused. It was as if you know the truth of a morning. You wake up and it's morning. It's it's not night. It's that kind of a truth. But it wasn't as if I could definitely change my focus. So I had control over that ability to, I couldn't take my eyes off of Jesus, but that was a loving desire, a continuation of my own free will to stay focused on him, despite the fact that there were so many other things around me. But it wasn't, I guess, as we do see in this life. It was far more intuitive, like an infused kind of experience. And I like your example though about the all around the world, because I've thought about that too. It's so interesting to see all these different depictions of Jesus, and I think as human beings, I just know that it's easy for us to identify with somebody that looks like us. I mean, people seem to want that all the time. You hear people will vote for a person, for a candidate, because they simply are the same color as them, or they look like them, or they'll do things a lot of times because of that familiarity. And I do think that there's some truth to that. Is that God's for everybody, so why wouldn't He allow people to see Him in a way that seems familiar to them?